Okay. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. We'll make a start. Nice to see everybody here this morning. Good morning, Judith. Nice to see you, Judith. Elian, Michael Gross. Nice to see you, Avram. All our regulars here and some of our newcomers. Always good. I see Danny Woolick is on the screen. And nice to see you, Danny. And Dina, our regular Dina. Nice to see you, Dina. And it's... When I give shiurim on Zoom as opposed to giving them face to face, I always miss out on the little bit of a 5-10 minutes of schmooze at the beginning of the shiur, where I can sort of connect to people on a personal level. So I try and do that on the screen, even though the screen is a bit sort of one-dimensional. Nevertheless, we're doing our best. What do you say, Ellie? At some point in the foreseeable future, we'll get back to a shiur face to face. You think so?
Yes, I do think so.
Okay, but, at least we've got to have it on our schedule somehow.
Yes,
we've got to have it on our dream.
I hope so.
Okay. Just to remind you, we are, of course, in this series of shiurim, we're looking at something very fascinating in the way the Torah was written. And that is that within the book of Bereshis are the seeds of all future events of Klal Yisrael. And somehow in this magic narrative of the book of Bereshis, there are ideas hidden which really were developed and repeated several times in the Tanakh and in Jewish history and in our lives as well. And one thing I was looking at this Purim, I'm still a little bit under the influence of Purim. I'm still sort of feeling a bit Purim spirited. Especially as Megillas Esther is really one of my most favorite parts of the Tanakh, a magnificent sefer. It's interesting, there are actually Chamesh Megillas, there are 5 Megillas, and yet in conversation, in whatever context you are, when you speak about the Megillah, everybody knows exactly what is the Megillah. The Megillah is Esther. When somebody says it's written in the Megillah, you don't think it's written in Koheles, you don't think it's written in Shir HaShirim. The Megillah is Esther. And when Chazal wrote a Masechta of Shas and Mishnah called Megillah, everybody understand they weren't talking about Megillas Eicha or Megillas Koheles. They were talking about Megillas Esther. So the definitive Megillah is Esther, both conceptually and halachically. Right? It's the only one which is really a proper full mitzvahs asay midrabanan, to read the Megillah and learn it and think about it. So we are still in the week after Purim, and we're going to have a look at the Megillah from the point of view of Sefer Bereshis. I just want to say good morning to Henry Israel. Good morning, nice to see you. Thank you for your sponsorship, and I hope you're well. You and your family are well.
Baruch Hashem, thank you.
Good. What is there in Sefer Bereshis which can be seen as a precursor in some way, an introduction to Megillas Esther? And there are actually several answers to that question, but I'm going to look today at one of them, one of my favorite ones, which even after I've learned it and taught it over the years a number of times, still remains to me something which is tantalizing in a certain sense, something which requires a deeper thought. And that is, we're going to be looking today at a text of the story of Yosef HaTzadik. The story of Yosef, in Parshas Vayeshev particularly, and also Miketz, the story of Yosef in many ways lays the foundations of the whole of Megillas Esther. And I want to have a look at how does that work in the text, and how does that work conceptually, and what we can take away from that is a very, very interesting parallelism between these two magnificent narratives. I also want to say good morning to Phil Stemmer. Nice to see you back, Phil. Good morning. Nice to see you. Hope you're well and the family. Okay, so we've got a story of Yosef HaTzadik, which is familiar to all of us, right? But it's interesting. What we're going to be doing in this year is looking at maybe a dozen or more very fascinating similarities between the two, such that there's no doubt in my mind, that when Esther and Mordechai were writing Megillas Esther, they had in mind the story of Yosef. They had in mind that they were in some way a replay, a repeat performance of the Yosef story. And a big picture, of course, both stories are dealing with how a Jewish individual rises to fame and power in a non-Jewish court and becomes beloved to the monarch. In one case, it's Paro appreciating Yosef, and the other, it's Achashverosh appreciating Esther, and how both of them manage to act in a very selfless way in order to protect the Jewish people in Golus. Both of them are stories not in Eretz Yisrael, they're both in Golus. In both cases, the Jewish people are very vulnerable to the non-Jewish culture and the non-Jewish authorities. And in both cases, both Yosef and Esther and Mordechai are able to use really unusual powers and unusual strategies to block any negativity from the non-Jewish environment and to assure the future of Klal Yisrael. What do Rachel? What do the story? What do they have in common? Esther and Mordechai on the one hand, and Yosef on the other. So for that, we'll have to look at the Medrash. The Medrash gives us an insight maybe into the similarities. But let's first start by looking at some text. See what we can get out of this text, because I think this is actually, again, it's a topic which I don't think is often really learnt quite so much in the detail, which is a pity because it does connect the later writings of Megillas Esther to the events of Bereshis, which are as I've said many times, the DNA of the future history of Klal Yisrael. So what's going on? Let's have a look, for example, here. Okay, how are we doing with the text? Can you see a text, Ellie? Yes? Good. Excellent. So I've entitled this Parallels Between Yosef and Megillas Esther. What we're going to be looking at for the next 10 minutes are really very interesting textual parallels, right? The parallels, when you find unusual textual expressions used in two different places, that is what Chazal call it's Omer Dorsheni. That needs to be understood. And it's not by chance. But the way in which Megillas Esther and Parshas Vayeshev indicates are connected by so many different unusual textual expressions. I'll tell you a nice fancy academic word. I know there's some people who like fancy academic words. In the academic world, this is called intertextuality. Not the sort of word you're going to use very often in conversation, but intertextuality means that there are clear textual points of contact between two seemingly different texts, but clearly one of them is basing itself on the earlier one. So here you have, for example, here's a relatively simple one. When it speaks about Achashverosh deciding to get himself a new wife, having got rid of Vashti, it says, "Vayafkein hamelech pekidim b'chol medinos malchusa." He appointed pekidim, right? Now the word pekidim, for anyone who visits government offices in Israel, the word pakid sends a bit of a shiver down your spine sometimes, a little bit, because the average pakid in a government office sees it as his or her duty to try and do everything possible to block whatever it is you want to achieve. But in the Tanakh, the pakid simply means a civil servant, somebody who is an officer of the government. So Achashverosh appoints special pekidim b'chol medinos malchusa, all over the country. And what did they do? They gathered the prettiest girls and basically abducted them and captured them and brought them in to the royal court. And Posuk says, "V'hanara shatita b'einei hamelech timlo tachas Vashti." And the plan was that that woman who would find the most favor in the eyes of the king, then she will become the queen instead of Vashti. And then there is this phrase, "Vayitav hadava b'einei hamelech." And the king liked this idea. Was an idea given to him by his advisors, and he liked the idea of appointing the Pekidim around the whole country, and in a sense, creating a new national project. And this is in Megillas Esther. But if you have a look at the story of Yosef, so Yosef appears before Paro, and he has just now interpreted the dream of Paro, of the 7 lean cows and the 7 fat cows. And he's told him what it means: 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And then Yosef proceeds to do something that he wasn't asked to do. Right? He was asked to interpret the dream, right? But this is a very interesting moment, actually, in the life of Yosef, because this is a very classic Jewish phenomenon. That Jews give sort of what's called unsolicited advice. When you ask somebody a question, you're likely to get not just directions. If you stop somebody in the street and ask directions, they'll give you directions, and then they'll give you advice about whether it's a good idea to go that direction. Maybe you should go into a different direction. What are you doing going there at all? They'll engage you. I remember once at Ner Yisrael, just as a footnote, I remember once in the Kehillah, a visiting American family turned up in shul one Shabbos morning, a very, very nice family, and they loved it in the shul, and I spoke to them, and I said, "How did you find out about us?" So he says, "Well, I'll tell you the truth, we didn't find out about you. We got up this morning, and we had a different shul in mind, and we went into the street, walking towards a different shul, and I won't tell you which one. And they stopped somebody on the street and said, "Can you tell me which is the way to that and that shul?" So they told him, and then he said, "Tell me, why are you going to that shul?" So he says, "Well, we're going to that shul." He says, No. He says, "I think you'll do much better going to a different shul." And they redirected them to come to our shul. And it was because of this unsolicited advice that they turned up, and we actually developed a friendship which continues to this day, even though they lived abroad, but they were redirected by unsolicited advice. This is a feature of Jewish life, which you have to live with. You'll get it when you sit on the bus holding your kid. 10 people around you will tell you how to feed the kid. If it's too cold, the kid is too hot. All the different advice that we're given. But we find this in the Torah, that Yosef is asked, "Please interpret the dream." So he interprets the dream. And then once he's finished interpreting the dream, and he says, "Oh, and by the way, I can give you free of charge some advice about how to manage this problem of the 7 years of plenty, followed by the 7 years of famine. I can tell you, I can be your management consultant and give you a plan, right?" And the king loves his plan. He loves his interpretation. He loves the plan. The Mefarshim ask, actually, why did Yosef do that? On a serious note, why did he do that? Because he understood that actually the mere fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had given Paro that sort of semi-prophetic dream message about the lean years and the years of plenty was clearly an indication that he should do something about it. In other words, he wasn't just told this as for entertainment purposes. He was told it in order that he should do something, and Yosef understood what he should do. But it is a dangerous practice, incidentally, giving unsolicited advice. And we find that actually tragically later on in the story of the Meraglim, of the spies in Parashat Shalach Lecha, where Moshe Rabbeinu asks them, "Please come back and tell us what the land looks like." And they come back and they tell what the land looked like, and they should have stopped. They should have stopped there and said, "Look, there's this, there's that, there's the other, there's this. This is what the fruit looked like. This is what the people look like. That's what they should have done what they were told. Instead of which, after having reported back to Moshe, they said, oh, and by the way, let us give you some free advice about the viability of making war with these people, and the viability is zero. There's no way we can succeed against these people, but their free advice was a disaster. Yosef's free advice to Paro was a blessing. And we're looking at a text here together. The pasuk here says that Yosef says to Paro, here's my advice. Yaseh HaMelech, this is what the king should do. Oops, sorry. This is what the king should do. V'yafked pekidim al haaretz. This phrase of v'yafked pekidim is a moment of intertextuality between Megillas Esther and the story of Yosef. In both cases, in the preparation for the main moment of the story, the king engages in an activity which is called Vayafked HaMelech Pekidim. You won't find that very often at all in the Tanakh. The idea of appointing a whole new department of civil servants. In this case, for Yosef, these were Pekidim whose job it was to store all the surplus food in the 7 years of plenty. Right? V'yikpatzu, right? That's right. V'yikpatzu also is a phrase that appears in both Megillas as v'yikpatzu as kol ochel hashanim hatovos. V'yikpatzu comes from the word kibbutz, right? To gather together all the surplus food. That is right. And for the word v'yikpatzu is also an intertextuality here. Just by the way, can you see this word here? This word here, v'yikpatzu, that these pekidim should gather all the food, the surplus food. And here also, in the Pasuk in Megillas Esther, it also says, v'yikpatzu. The job of the pekidim is v'yikpatzu, to gather together all potential beautiful women for the king to find himself a new queen. So this is a very clearly, when they were writing Megillas Esther, they used the words that the Torah, because they had in front of them the Chumash, right? Mordechai and Esther, when they write in Megillas Esther, they had in front of them the Chumash. They were familiar with every word of the Chumash, and they're purposely using Vayifkod HaMelech Pekidim V'yikpatzu, this whole phrase. And then that was the advice given to the king, and the response of the king in Megillas Esther is Vayitav Hadavar Ba'inei HaMelech. Can you see I've highlighted that? That the king, Achashverosh, was thrilled with this idea of building a new harem for himself and having the beautiful women of the kingdom gathered together for his choice. And the same thing is true at the end of the story here, that Yosef has said to Paro to collect all the surplus food, and the pasuk says, "Vayitav hadavar ba'einei Paro." Exactly the same phrase. So you have within 2 or 3 psukim, you have Vayafked HaMelech, Pekidim, V'yikpatzu, Vayitav hadavar. That sequence of verbs is exactly identical between Megillas Esther and the story of Yosef. So this is one of the contact points between these 2 stories. Another one is also very fascinating, the idea of Chaim, the idea of being Moitze Chaim, right? That we find from the very beginning with Yosef, that it says, Vayimtza Yosef Chaim Ba'einav, Vayesharis Oso, V'yifkadei al Beiso. Yosef arrives as a slave and is taken in by Potiphar as a slave in his house, right? And then he suddenly realized this is not ordinary slave. It's difficult to translate actually properly into English. What does it mean to be Moitze Chaim? Moitze Chaim isn't really directly related to aesthetic beauty. It's got to do something with a gracefulness or a deeper. Has anybody got any offerings, any offers on how would you translate Vayimtza Chaim Ba'einav? I think usually found favor in his eyes. But what does that mean really? There must be a better word than Vayimtza Chaim Ba'einav.
Could it be an inner beauty? An
inner beauty? Okay, so in the case of Esther, we could say it's an inner beauty. But in the case of Potiphar and Yosef, it's not clear that what the master of the house is looking for is beauty. He's mainly looking for competence. He's looking for somebody who can really do the job properly. So it's more than just beauty. It's some sort of inner harmony or inner abilities. It's certainly an inner quality. To be moitzechein is, and here we find with Esther a couple of times. It says here it says Vatahi Esther noses chein ba'ini kol ro'eha. Pasuk says in chapter 2 that as Esther was moitze, everybody who met her and got to know her, she was moitzechein ba'ineihem. She found favor in their eyes in this magic quality of chein.
Like,
and here again,
a certain like
it's repeated.
attraction, like an attraction of
Yes.
The resonating together.
That's right. It's some sort of, thank you, Judith. It's some sort of intuitive attraction that this person and his soul and his way of thinking and his personality in some way resonates with you, and you feel this is somebody I can work with. This is somebody I'd like to spend more time with. This is chein. Chein is a magical quality. And here it says with Esther.
The word you're looking for, Rabbi, is charisma.
Charisma, okay. Thank you, Michael. Yes, could be. Charisma comes into it. Charisma is a form of personality, a certain mix of talents and abilities and warmth. I think it has to do with warmth as well. But anyhow, it's interesting that both in the relationship between the Potiphar, the king's one of the king's servants, and with Ahasuerus, this idea of chein was critical. And here with Esther, it's mentioned twice. Here, it's interestingly, the chein is connected to chesed, that in some way he felt her to be selfless and lack of. In a sense, chein also is connected to people who are not focusing on their own ego, who are able to focus on others. This is something we find repeatedly connected to the quality of chein. We find also, for example, that Yosef, in this narrative of Yosef, the exit visa of Yosef from prison was his care and concern about the baker and the butler who were looking depressed. And because he was concerned about them and he was worried about them, he asked them what's going on, and they told him their bad dreams, and he interpreted it for them. So we find that, but had he not had that selflessness, had he not had that quality of looking to help other people, he couldn't have, the story wouldn't have worked. Yosef would have been stuck in prison. So chein has got to do something with selflessness. So let's move on. So we first had Vayafkein HaMelech Pekidim. I'm not actually going to go through all the similarities, but just the ones that I find most prominent. The first is this Vayafkein HaMelech Pekidim Vayikpatzu Vayitav Hadavar. That textuality is very clear. Here the chein is very clear. Here's another one, is that both Esther and Yosef are described as being physically beautiful. He omen as Hadassah, he Esther Bastodo, and she was Yefas Torah v'Tovas Mara. That she was exceptionally beautiful and good looking, right? And with Yosef, if I'm not mistaken, Yosef is in fact the only man in the Tanakh who is called Yefei Torah v'Yefei Mara, right? Yosef is given also a title which is usually only used for women, relating to their physical beauty. Here, Yosef's physical beauty is also a factor. So both of them have this pasuk used about them. The Fas Toah, the Tovas Mara for Esther, and for Yosef it's Yefei Toah, the Yefei Mara.
Wasn't also Rivka like that?
Sorry?
Mano?
Didn't hear what you said.
Wasn't Rivki Mano also described that way?
Rivka Imenu,
No.
not that I recall. Not that I recall.
It does say about David Habalch Yefei Einayim.
Yes, you're quite right. It does
Oh,
say
maybe it
about
was
David-
Rachel. Must have been Rachel. then.
Rachel, it says that too, if
Yes, you're quite right. Thank
That's
you
why
very
these are her
much.
descendants.
Thank you very much. With Rachel as well, I was going to come to that a bit later on. With Rachel, it also says that she was Yefas Toa and Tovas Mare, right? It says about Rachel. Let's just have a quick look. Where is that written about Rachel? 1 second. Okay, so it must be somewhere in Vayetze.
The end of Shani, I think.
End of Shani. We've got a Balkore here. 1 second. You're absolutely right. Who said that? The closing words of Shani. Rachel hoysa yefas toa v'yefas mare. Parshas Vayetze, chapter 29, pasuk 17. She's also considered Yefas Toa and Yefas Mare. And why is that very important here, ladies and gentlemen? Why could that be why is that an important missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle? That Rachel has got this Yefas Toa, Yefas Mare.
Because he's a descendant.
That's right.
Also Mordechai.
One of the important connections between Yosef on the one hand and Mordechai and Esther on the other hand is that they are both B'nai Rachel. And we're going to, at the end of the shir, I hope to be able to maybe look at that a bit more in depth, that because they are both B'nai Rachel, there's something about B'nai Rachel, the children of Rachel, because Rachel's children are only Yosef and Binyamin, right? So Yosef is one child, and Mordechai and Esther are both Ish Yemini. They both come from the tribe of Binyamin, and they are both B'nai Rachel. So in actual fact, whatever it is that is unique about Yosef on the one hand and Mordechai and Esther on the other hand, in some way they are representing a particular strand within the Jewish people, right? A particular quality, a particular level of both skills and emunah that they can play a particular role, and that which is associated with Rachel Imein, that they are B'nai Rachel in some sense. And one of the interesting hallmarks of that is the Yefas Toa and Yefas Mare, and it's not by chance. Again, you should understand the text of the Chumash. In the text of the Tanakh, every word is significant. It's not by chance that they chose to describe Esther as Yefas Toa and Yefas Mare, and Yosef as Yefei Toa and Yefei Mare, because they both wanted to highlight that connection to their grandmother, Yosef's case, his mother, and in Mordechai and Esther's case, their grandmother was also Yefas Toa and Yefas Mare. Okay, so here we have, so that is really our third connection, right? The first is V'yafke Pekidim, the second is Nosechaim, the third is Yefas Toa, Yefas Mare. And here we have also the emphasis on love between people, which is not so common in the in the Tanakh, but here it says Vayehav. It doesn't just say he took her as his wife. It could have simply said that Achashverosh took her as his queen. It says Vayehav Melech es Esther mikol hanoshim, that he loved her mikol hanoshim. In other words, he looked at all the women, and none of the women evoked in him the love that Esther evoked in him. Actually, it's interesting because Achashverosh himself is not known for his love. He's not a person who's involved in love. He's involved in power. He's involved in wealth. He's involved in self-indulgence. And nevertheless, the Torah here uses the word to love, that Esther is the most beloved. And here we find also with Yosef, the Yosef story, the Yisrael Ohab as Yosef Mikol Bona. Right? That Yaakov loved Yosef more than any of the other of his children. So like Yosef is the most beloved of all his group, similarly Esther is the most beloved of all the women with whom she is compared. And the Apostle repeats it again, Ki oso ohav avihem mikolech. That the brothers saw that, so in the case of Yosef, actually, him being most beloved was a problem for him, right? His being, there are some, in as much as there are lots of similarities, there are also some contrasts. So, for example, it's worth mentioning, with Yosef, him being most beloved caused a problem for him. Because he was the most beloved, that aroused the jealousies of his brothers, and because of that, he was sold and the subsequent events. Similarly, Yosef's beauty was a problem for him. It was because of his beauty that Mrs. Potiphar found him irresistible. So, and that was a problem for him. So whereas the beauty for Esther was part of her strength and part of her ability to get into the position from which she was able later on to save Klal Yisrael, for Yosef, it was actually a problem for him, although funnily enough, paradoxically, even though it was a problem for Yosef in the here and now, it laid the pathway for him to be able afterwards to reach the position of power, to be able to help his brothers and his family, and to establish Klal Yisrael in Egypt for that period. So you find, and that's what Yosef says at the end of the story. He says, "Youth, right? You intended to do me harm, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu chashav al teva." This was all part of the divine plan. Yosef recognized in retrospect that even though while he was going through it, he was suffering, but in retrospect, he saw clearly the Yad Hashem. And that's also a very interesting similarity on a deeper level. We're not talking about textual similarity, but in terms of thematic similarity between Yosef on the one hand and Mordechai and Esther on the other hand. In both cases, as the events were unfolding, we can't understand why these things are happening. Why is Yosef HaTzadik subjected to all these the hatred of his brothers, sold as a slave, being maligned by Mrs. Potiphar, thrown into prison? It all seems one disaster after another. And similarly, Esther being abducted, right? And don't forget, if you followed the chronology in Megillas Esther, right, from the day that Esther is taken into the king's court until the time that she's actually able to play a role to save Klal Yisrael is 5 years. She's sitting for 5 years married to this guy, right? Thinking to herself, why did God do this to me? There must be some reason why HaKadosh Baruch Hu put me in this terrible situation. And actually, there's an interesting posuk in the Megillah which shows a bit about Mordechai's dedication to Esther. The posuk says, "Uvechol yom v'yom, Mordechai mishalech b'chatzar hamelech, lo da'as ma shaloim Esther o ma ye'oseh bo." When you think about it for a minute, b'chol yom v'yom, every day, for how long? For 5 years. Think about that. For 5 years, b'chol yom v'yom, every day, Mordechai is thinking to himself, why would this possibly have happened to Esther? There must be some reason why Esther has been kidnapped, basically, by this non-Jewish king and subjected to a life in a non-Jewish harem. When Esther is such a woman of such great spiritual and Jewish content, right? Don't forget, Chazal say that Megillas Esther, Ruach HaKodesh nichtav. Esther is writing with Ruach HaKodesh, right? So she is a woman of the greatest possible stature. And something has happened to her here. She's been kidnapped and taken by a non-Jewish king and forced to submit to him. Right? Why has this happened to her? And the same thing must have been going through Yosef's mind. Why is this, and Yaakov's mind, why has this happened to my beloved son Yosef? So while it's going on, this is one of the thematic similarities, that while it's going on, we can't understand why it's happening, right? But eventually, at the climax of the whole story, it suddenly all becomes clear that this was a series of events necessary to save Am Yisrael. Also, incidentally, in both of these stories, there is no prophecy, there are no miracles. It seems to be a sequence of chance events, on a very human level. So let's go a bit further now in the text. Okay, what else do we have here? Oh, at the end of the story, It says about, in Megillas Esther, it says, Vayosa HaMelech is tabata me'el yodo, vayitno lahama ben amdasa. He took off his ring, Achashverosh takes off his ring, and he gives it to Haman. That was a transfer of power from the king to a Mishneh Lamelech, to somebody who is second in command to the king, to the viceroy, right? This happens in Esther, and exactly the same word is used with Yosef. Vayosef Paro is tabata me'el yodo, vayitenos al yad Yosef. Again, the king himself, but these words are very interesting words. Vayosar, right? Vayosar HaMelech is tabata. An exact replay of these 5 words, right? Vayosar HaMelech is tabata me'al yodo. These 6 words appear exactly again, right, in the Megillah and in the Yosef story, right? And you won't find them anywhere else in the Tanakh. Vayosar HaMelech is tabata me'al yodo, right? The king takes off his ring and really entrusts his royal power to give the royal consent to other people. This is another very powerful intertextuality, a very powerful point of contact between these 2 stories. Let's go a bit further. Right, in both cases, there is a moment of extreme grief. In other words, there is a low point in both stories where it seems like disaster is happening, and in both cases, somebody does kriya. They tear their clothes. Mordechai, you can see here in chapter 4, Mordechai, when he hears that the decree of Haman, the genocidal decree of Haman, has gone out, he does kriya. He tears his clothes as a sign of terrible grief. And the same thing is said about Reuven when he suddenly realizes that he can't save Yosef. He thought he was going to save Yosef, and it's like Yikra Espagod. He tears his clothes, he does kriya. Kriya is a very powerful, emotional act in the Torah in several places. Incidentally, I just want to mention to you in the Haftorah of Parshas Zochar that we had recently, in the story of Shaul HaMelech, there's an interesting reference there which can be understood in different ways, but I find it fascinating that when Shmuel HaNovi tells Shaul HaMelech that's it, you've made such a major error in leaving Agag alive that you've lost your rights to be the future king of Israel. And Shaul begs him, and in the end, and then Shmuel says, no, it's too late, you've made the mistake, and you're clearly not worthy to be the king. The kingdom is going to be given to somebody else. And at that point, if you look at the narrative, in that point, what it says is that Shmuel then turned to leave, and Shaul grabs him, and then it says, Vayikras begodo. He tore his clothes. Shmuel's clothes were torn. And a simple reading of it, you might think it means that simply Shaul was trying to get him to stay. Shmuel decided to leave. And in that sort of struggle, his clothes were torn. But the Meforshim say something else. The Meforshim say is that Shmuel did kriya. Shmuel HaNovi saw it as a major moment of tragedy in the life of the Jewish people, that this man who could have been the king of Israel was lost, and that was Shaul HaMelech, that he did Vayikra Espagod. He tore his clothes, and that was that Shmuel did kriya on the so-called the loss of Shaul. So here as well, Mordechai, to express his grief over the royal decree of genocide, tears his clothes, but we find the precedent is with Reuven. Reuven sees, we have to credit Reuven he's the only person who sees what has been done to Yosef at the very beginning, that he's been sold as a slave, and he realizes that this is the deepest possible tragedy. This is a moment of Dayan HaEmes. This is a moment of Kriya, right? This is a moment when tearing one's clothes is appropriate as an act of Kriya. Okay. Let's go weiter. Now here comes a very interesting textual structure, which is also very rare in the Torah. That Esther says to Mordechai, okay, I'm willing to play my role, but you must give me support. Lech kenosos kol Yehudim, hanimtzoim b'Shushan, v'tzubo alai v'altochlu v'tishtu shlosha yomim laila v'yom. Right, so you remember this very powerful point in the whole narrative. But she says, I'm willing to go to the king to beg from Jewish people, but I need that the Jewish people, first of all, that they are united together, kenos as kol Yehudim, to unite Klal Yisrael, and that you have to fast for me. The 3 days, right? I think did we discuss this in a previous shir? What were these 3 days? Yes, I think I looked at that. The 3 days was Pesach, right? So I'm not looking at that at the moment. What I am interested in is these last 3 words, which I've highlighted here. If you promise to get the Jewish people together and fast for me, I'll go and do what is impossible. But kasher ovadati. And if I'm lost, then I'm lost. In other words, this is one of the most saddest moments, really, in the narrative of Esther, that she's putting her life on the line. I'm just thinking, I don't remember, I know we've had a couple of shiurim already about Megillas Esther. Did I mention to you, B'kashi Obadati, that the Chazal say about her, yes, that she thought she was on a suicide mission. Kasha Obadati means I'm willing to lose everything. I'm willing to lay down my life to save Klal Yisrael. Kasha Obadati say Chazal that Esther's plan A was that she would make a fake confession to confess to Achashverosh that she and Haman were having an affair, and then Achashverosh would have no choice, but he would have to execute both of them, and that would be the end of Haman. So she was willing. Kasha Obadati means I'm willing to go in there. I'll try and do what I can to kill Haman, even if it means suicide, my own suicide. But Kasha Obadati, I'm willing to give up my life. But this phrase, Kasha Ovadati, is a very dramatic and very unusual piece of text. And the only other time we find that is here, within the Yosef story. So Yosef, because he wants to bring his brothers down to Egypt, he demands to see Binyamin, right? The famous story. And Yaakov says, no. In the end, they're starving. They have no choice. They have to go back to Yosef to get the food. And then he says, see, what does Yaakov say? HaKadosh Baruch Hu should look after you in front of this anonymous man. And send out your other brother, meaning Shimon. But look at this amazing similarity between this phrase, Kasha Shakolti, and Esther's phrase, Kasha Ovadati. Right? Yaakov is saying, Kasha Shakolti, I'm willing to risk losing the most precious person in my whole life, which is Binyamin, the sole remnant of my beloved wife Rachel, having lost Yosef, right? And now I'm going to lose Binyamin, but Kasha Shakolti. If I'm going to lose him, then I've lost him. And if I've lost him, I've lost my whole life. My life is no longer worth living. That's the implication of this pasuk. But the similarity in text is extraordinary. You must always have in mind when you're reading the text of Megillas Esther that this is Esther and Mordechai writing down their account of the events. And they're choosing their words carefully in order that this should get into the Tanakh. They wanted that the Megillas Esther should be accepted by the Anshe Knesset Gdola into the Tanakh. And what they're doing is they are using key words in the story of Yosef in order to frame the events that they've been going through. They want to try and convince, if you like, the Anshe Knesset Gdola and you and me and all subsequent generations that the events that they went through were not chance events. The events that they went through were the events of Yosef HaTzadik. We are replaying Yosef HaTzadik. Kasha Shakolti was in their mind from the pasuk in Bereshis Mem Gimel. So Esther writes down, Bakasha Ovadati. If I'm lost, then I'm willing to sacrifice my most precious, my life itself, and my reputation. I will be executed as an adulteress. I'm willing to be executed as an adulteress, not just lose my life, but lose my life in the most humiliating way possible in order to save Klal Yisrael. And that's what it means, Kasha Ovadati. And in that sense, that's another interesting connection. Let's go a bit further. Right. So when the story of Yosef gets a bit happier, that Haman is forced to take Mordechai through the streets. He takes him through the city, and he calls before him. Right? Haman is humiliated and forced to honor Mordechai publicly and take him through the streets and call before him. It's also very interesting. What does it mean, call before him? It means in some way to make this announcement, a constant announcement. This is the man the king wants to honor. Compare that to the story of Yosef. Once Paro has appointed Yosef, so whereas here it says Vayarkivuhu b'socho, in Esther it says from the word laharkiv, right? The word rechev means a vehicle, right? A rechev is today it means a car, but it meant a wagon. It meant a sort of a royal chariot. So here it says also Vayarkev also b'merkeves hamishna Vayikru lefonov avrei, right? That he called. You have exactly the same two words. You have the Vayarkivuhu and the Vayikru lefonov, exactly the same words. That Esther and Mordechai writing the Megillah, they wanted to use the phrase used about Yosef centuries earlier to describe what happened to Mordechai at the end of the Megillah, that he is taken in a royal chariot, and Vayikru lefonov, that an announcement was made. This man is the most favored person of the king. And this happens both with Mordechai and with Yosef. Okay, here is really pretty much the last similarity of text I've chosen for this morning. There are more, but here's an interesting one, and that goes a bit back to the earlier part of the Megillah, where Mordechai refuses to bow down. And remember that Mordechai's refusal to bow down is a nisayon for him, right? He's being tested in a certain sense. He's being tested. Would he submit to Haman? And Vayomru Avdei HaMelech say to him, Vayomru Avdei HaMelech, the servants of the kings, Asher B'Shar HaMelech say to him, Madua ata oves mitzvos HaMelech, why are you defying the kings? Vayehi, look at this word here, Vayehi. So this Vayehi appears in Bereshis as well, Vayehi. And here it says, Ka'omrom Elov Yom Yom. There's a Greek sieve here, whether it's Be'omrom or Ke'omrom. You would have thought it makes no difference, Be'omrom or Ke'omrom, but actually there's quite a lot of interesting stuff on that, but not for now. But he Ke'omrom Elov Yom Yom. They said it to him every day. A phrase you don't find anywhere else. Ke'omrom Elov Yom Yom. Daily they were hacking at Mordechai. Please do us a favor. Don't antagonize this man Haman. Bow down to him. But Oshama Aleh. So look at this. I think this is the most extraordinary similarity. But Shama Alehem, Mordechai refuses to listen to them. Compare this to the pasuk of Mrs. Potiphar seducing Yosef. And it says, Vayhi kadabra el Yosef yom yom. She speaks to him yom yom, just like it says here with Mordechai yom yom. Here it says with Yosef yom yom, v'lo shama eleha, and he wouldn't listen to her. So you have an exactly parallel expression in the pasuk in Megillas Esther, based on just like Yosef resisted the temptation of Mrs. Potiphar. For all her seduction, she didn't manage to change his mind. But Shama Eleha, he wouldn't listen to her. In a similar way, Mordechai is being begged daily, please bow down to Haman. Just bow down to him, and if you bow down to him, all will be okay. But Shama Eleha, he's not willing to do so. He's not willing to bow to Haman. He's not willing to submit himself to Haman. But the similarity here is the most striking. I've left it to the last because, interestingly, it's dafka of this example that Chazal in the Medrash, for the first time that I could find, actually wake up to this theme that I'm talking to you about. Look at this theme in the Medrash Rabbi. I haven't brought you the translation here, but can you see this is Esther Rabbah? Esther Rabbah means this is the Medrash Rabbah on Megillas Esther, right? Esther Rabbah. So here, this is now the words of Chazal. Let's go through this together. So Chazal says as follows: Vayehi ka'amram elov yom yom. Look at this, Rabbi say. This is very beautiful. Rabbi Yochanan b'shei Rabbi Yamin Rav Levi. So this was said by Rabbi Yochanan. I want you to emphasize these words. Boneha shel Rachel. Suddenly the cat is out of the bag. What is going on here? Oops. What is going on here? These people are both Boneha. Sorry. Sometimes this just runs away. I just want to highlight this for a minute. Boneha shel Rachel. The children of Rachel. Sorry. Something is going wrong here. Bear with me for 1 second. Just get this text right. Okay, look at this. Boneho shel Rochel, Nissan Shove Ugduloson Shove. And this I find is if you like, this is the key phrase of Chazal for the whole shir that I've given you today. That what the common factor between the Yosef story and the Esther story is they are both Boneho shel Rochel. They're the children of Rachel, and the Medrash says Nissan Shaveh. They are equivalent. They're similar in their Nissan, in their nace. In other words, the miraculous turn of events. It doesn't mean nace in the sense of anything supernatural, because there was nothing supernatural about either story, not the Yosef story, nor the Esther story. But Nissan Shaveh, there was something miraculous about the sequence of events that just clicked together in order to produce a Hatzalah for Klal Yisrael.
It can't be also that their trials were similar, because they also had
very
similar
good.
trials.
Yes, I'm going to come to that
That's
in
how
a
I
moment.
understood it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. The word Nissan has an ambiguity to it, a very beautiful ambiguity. I think the Pasha Pshat is that Nissan means their nace, meaning their miracle, but you're quite right. Nissan could also be Nisoyo. Their tests were similar. They were tested in a similar way. They were tested by giving power, by giving beauty. They were both given beauty. They were given chayim. They were given power. They could have both exploited, used all their chayim and power for their own benefits, instead of which they were both selfless and dedicated only to the future of Klal Yisrael, both Yosef and Esther. That's what they had in common. And the Medrash here says that the secret is Rachel. Rachel Imeni. And the children of Rachel, Nissan Shaveh, their miracles were similar, ugduloson shok, and their greatness was similar. Right? Their greatness was similar. They both had similar extraordinary abilities and talents and emunah. And then he goes on to say, Nisan Shaveh Hador Diksiv Vahi Kadabra El Yosef Yom Yom, and here it says Ka'amram Elav Yom Yom Shama Aleha. So this is one of the similarities that I just mentioned to you. It's mentioned here in the Medrash, the one about Yom Yom, and then it says how long Shama Aleha. Right, and then the other similarity is Vayosa Paro. That Yosef is given the ring and royal garments, and here it also says and also it says so here you find this medrash brings down three different textual similarities. But the principle here, suddenly Chazal gave us the mafteach. The mafteach is Boneha Shel Rochel, the children of Rochel in some way. And just to this footnote here at the bottom comes from the Torah Tamima, Mordechai Alevi Epstein. So he writes in Torah Tamima about this medrash. He says, Rotzaloma, what does it mean? He says it means despite the fact of being begged daily, both Yosef was begged daily by Mrs. Potiphar and Mordechai was begged daily by the king's courtiers. Nisharu b'cholzos be'emunosam, they remained firm and steadfast in their emunah. Yosef b'inyono, v'Mordechai b'inyono. Both Yosef and Mordechai. The Korov Loma. Here comes the point that you didn't mention before. The Halosha Nissan Shebakan in Yono Nisoya, says the Torah to me. The word Nissan doesn't only mean a miracle, but it also means the test. Reish Lama means Rotzaloma Shebishneim Hoyashova La'amod B'Nisoya Yom Yom. Both of them were able to withstand the daily pressure to give in, and neither of them did. So let's just summarize here at the end of the shir. Let's just summarize what we've learned and what does it mean? What does it mean? So in a sense, there is something here very profound, which I'll be coming back to in the future shiurim, the issue of Rachel and Leah. The Rachel and Leah story is a very, very profound issue in the future of Klal Yisrael. But here we're just looking at one detail of it. Rachel, the children of Rachel have a particular ability to do what? To save Klal Yisrael from their non-Jewish enemies. In some sense, yes?
The Rachel was the only one that didn't bow to Esav because she was behind. So so the Bnei Rachel are the only ones that could really fight Amalek, and Haman was Amalek. Okay,
so that is definitely one line of commentary. Thank you very much, Tina. You're absolutely right. That in some way, the beginning of Vayishlach, everybody bows down to Esav, except for Rachel, and indeed Binyamin isn't even born yet at that time. So there is no bowing down at that point. But we do find something in fact, the culmination of this principle of the Bnei Rachel is not in the Pasuk so much, but in Chazal, who speak about the Messianic period. In Yemos HaMashiach, so if you look in the text of Yeshaya and Zechariah, it speaks about Es Tzemach David Avdecha Meira Tatzmiach, and the Mashiach is going to be a Ben David, right? And David is, of course, the tribe of Yehuda. But what other Mashiach is there in the writings of Chazal? Anybody want to add in here?
Ben Yosef.
Yes, Mashiach ben Yosef. There's Mashiach ben David. So Mashiach ben David is the spiritual leader of the future of Klal Yisrael. But Mashiach ben Yosef, right, uses that power of Bnei Rachel to fight Amalek and to fight the enemies of Klal Yisrael at the end of days. So Chazal tell us explicitly that Mashiach ben Yosef is uniquely able to do something that Yehuda can't do. They've got somehow this power of Racha. What exactly it is, whatever it is, it's written into these stories. These are two stories. Story of Yosef and the story of Mordechai and Esther. These are two reflections of what? Say Chazal, B'nai Racha. They both have the beauty, the power, the chayin, the emunah, the selflessness. They have that. They are both able to rise to enormous levels of power and influence to be the Mishnah LaMelech. And in both cases, they use them only for one thing: to preserve the future of Klal Yisrael, to protect other people in a most selfless way. And that is the power of B'nai Rachel. And in that way, I think we can see it brings out a new dimension, appreciation of Megillas Esther, by seeing that behind many, many psukim of Megillas Esther, the people who wrote it, meaning Mordechai and Esther themselves, were thinking of Yosef Atzad and were borrowing phrases all the time, borrowing ideas and ways of expression from the Chumash of the Yosef story, and that contains within it a very interesting message. That's it for today, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Nice to see you all.